As a soulless virus spread, vulnerability and disparity bred. A nation that can lead the way, guided by head and gilded by heart. Alas, saw the divide drift further apart. To rise above prejudice and give way to justice, to embrace every human with equity and dignity. It's time for true humanity. Our tomorrow calls out to us, invoking passion and purpose. And what each one of us does today can influence our way of living and rise as a nation of a billion thriving.
Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to the 12th Annual Dasra Philanthropy Week. I think it's good evening for us from India. It's good afternoon to a few of you I see out there, and perhaps a very good, in fact, definitely a very good early morning for some of you. Thank you so much for making the time to join us today. So the theme of this year's forum is A Billion Thriving, and the Dasra Philanthropy Week marks the beginning of this movement that each one of us must make our own. If there's one key takeaway that we'd like you to walk away with through our session today, as well as the dialogues across the week, it is that we urgently need to shift conversations in philanthropy to talk not only about surviving, but also thriving. And we can enable our most vulnerable to thrive only when each of us embraces a strong lens of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We're calling this the Jedi lens in all of our work. We must recognize that last year has been a difficult year for all of us, and where has never been a more important time for us to come together. In fact, a lot of us last year perhaps collaborated in ways we never imagined. And so seeing the importance of collaborating and the nascency of collaborating, we're very excited to actually have India's pioneering top 13 collaboratives join us today. And really the idea here is, as we go through this learning lab, can we learn about each of these collaboratives and how they're addressing their engagement in government, how they're working with funders, how they're managing implementing partners, really as a learning lab. So we have 2 hours today. And I must admit, there are moments in the 2 hours where you're asking yourself, why am I here? And you're tuning yourself out, which is fine, but think about it as a masterclass. Think about it as when you were in school. Push through the 2 hours, reflecting on what can we do as a community, because really towards the end, there is a call to action to ask each of you, how do we build a learning agenda and come together on really strengthening collaboration towards a billion thriving. I have a wonderful set of super experienced people who have kicked off collaboratives, but I also have Olivia here, who leads one of the most foremost collaboratives globally. But before I get there, let me just give you a sense of who is this group of collaboratives. And they've been kind enough to bear with us in being able to collect some information. And the idea being that we wanted to play back to this group, what is the collaborative universe really looking like? And so we went to our Bridgespan friends, who often are superb at defining things. So thank you, Pritha and team. And we used this definition for what is a collaborative. So take a few minutes to read this. Then we asked all of us in the community here and there, who are some collaboratives that have started, and how do we begin to engage them to kick off this community of learning? And you'll see those names, we're calling them survey participants because they agreed to share, their background. So we did a quick dipstick and we said, okay, so who is this group? What's it looking like as we kick off this community of learning? Interestingly enough, many are nascent. So out of the 13, we asked, when did you start? 7 of them started last year. 6 of them have started the last 5 years. So very nascent sector in terms of collaboratives in India. Then we said, what's this cohort looking like? It's an emerging cohort of collaboratives, but interestingly enough, some ecosystem players, like those in entrepreneurship and capacity building, towards then more of a demographic to then the more sector-based. And so you'll see that kind of breakdown here. By no means are we saying this is statistically significant or any of that. We're just giving you some noodles to noodle with as each of our collaboratives begin to speak to their experience in the different themes. Then finally, we said, how experienced are you in leading collaboratives? And I'm sure they'll all speak to, and you'll start to also recognize it's minimal and there's no prior experience. And so we're very excited towards the end of this conversation to have Richard from Collaborate Up, who's really building tools and modules and ways to strengthen that capacity, to speak to his experience and what does that mean for our community here in India. And then finally, what does it take collaboratives to be successful is often this backbone organization. And we're finding that that is typically intermediaries. We're going to hear from both the implementing organization as well as the one, the funder. And finally, these are sort of around a team size of 20. And so that's a quick snapshot of this universe. I want to bring Olivia in at this point. I'm sure many of you know who Olivia is. I think she's been an inspiration for us. I must say it's taken us as Dasra 22 years to get to itty bitty collaborative with only small amounts of funding in comparison. So I know, Olivia, what you've been able to do in terms of influence, frankly, a pot of cash to actually make a difference with, I think inspires us all. So would love for you to lean in, give us your global perspective. Why did you start Co-Impact? What was the motivation, and where do you see some of the similarities or not similarities in terms of the aggregate view?
First of all, thanks so much, Neera, and thanks to Dasra for including me here with this amazing group of collaboratives. I think it's always interesting when you ask people also how experienced they are, because my guess is people also underestimate how experienced they are in this. I think it's really a remarkable group here, both speaking and then I think also in terms of those joining for the discussion. I will share a few reflections, and I think the key one, if we think about the theme for this week of A Billion Thriving, really ultimately, I think we can all agree that in order for that to happen, it's not going to be any one person, any one organization. It will require this kind of collaboration that we're talking about here. And so I think both, Neera, as you kicked off with the Jedi lens, that's absolutely crucial, and completely 100% agree with that. And also the collaboration being so key to everything that we do. So I think it really does require that. What's interesting about the definition, as you shared it here, is this is both about collaboration across different actors and also including funders in the mix. And I think one of the things that we see around the world is that oftentimes in funding, it's not actually necessarily aligned with collaboration. We're seeing more of that happening, which I think is very exciting, which is both funders coming together and recognizing the need to align funding, to take a longer term view, and also to support these kinds of collaborations that are required in order to see this kind of systems shifts that we're talking about here, and to really have the kind of scale of impact. And so I know that's the discussion that we'll be having as part of the next 2 hours as well, is what does it really take, and how does collaboration really come in across these different actors to be able to see the results that can come in as a result of this, that's more than any one. So I'll say a few things, and then I know we'll get into all of these just in terms of a few reflections. And as one note, just for those that don't know, Co-Impact, we bring together, so we bring together funders to support collaborations or ecosystems of actors that are working towards systems change. So it's the collaboration both on the funder side as well as in terms of the efforts that we're supporting. And I think the first thing, and we'll get into this as we look at some of the data and the reflections from this group, but that collaboration takes time, it takes trust, and it really does, and recognizing the upfront investment in order to see the impact longer term. And so we really see the importance of that. And for example, one of the things that we do as Co-Impact, and that I think we see others do as well, is actually taking that time up front. So we provide funding for that for as we look towards the longer term, what does it take to really help to build those kinds of relationships and trust in the collaboration? And I think amongst funders as well, it's how do you look at what your aligned goals are, your values, how do you actually build that same trust too? The second thing I think, which I also saw came out, is this kind of question of the funding and resources crunch that people feel, especially when it comes to collaboration, because so much of funding is about just one organization. Why are you better than the others, rather than necessarily how can you come together with others to do this kind of ecosystem, long-term systems work. So I'm really keen to hear what people have to say about that. And I think it's interesting here, as you talked about the stage of development too, I think we tend to find more experienced funders engaging in these kinds of collaborations. And I think it's exciting to think also about how some newer funders can also do that as a way to sort of jumpstart the impact that they can have as well. And then the final reflection is that I think that there really are things that we can learn from one another. And that's where this idea of a learning lab, I've been part of several where we basically can exchange in 2 hours. It will go quickly, but the details on things like governance and operations and a lot of the things that we won't necessarily get into all the details up here, but they're really important. And so being able to have people to turn to say, how can we have the most impact and what have you learned, I think is so key. So I'm really excited about that. So those are some thoughts for as we kick off the discussion.
Yeah, Olivia, just one question before I pass it on to the collaboratives themselves. Have you seen any geographical differences? Do you feel certain regions are approaching it, differently? Any sense of that? And where do you invest, I guess, as co-impact? Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that we certainly have been seeing around the world some movement towards this collaboration. I think actually in India, you actually see more of this kind of collaborative work than in many other parts of the world. So I think certainly some of the collaborators that we turn to both to support and to learn from are in India. And we do a lot of work in India as well. So I would say that as we look around, but there certainly are, I think many of the lessons kind of come across different geographies. I think anytime you're really trying to look at scale of impact and kind of longevity or sustainability of impact, that's where this kind of collaboration really does come in. And I think that's a universal.
So that's great. Thanks, Olivia. We're going to just move into the next segment, but I hope at the very end, if you promise to give us some tips, other than your magnetic personality, how did you convince these funders to give you hundreds of millions of dollars? So, can you share some of those secrets at the very end? So please do share. We're going to move to the three segments that, in fact, Olivia and I, as we prepared for this, thought were important themes that have cut across region, have cut across types of collaboratives, and are common. And really, the first one is discussing the role of the government in collaboratives, because we've seen that the link between government and really approaching and conquering and delivering on systems change, you can't do it without the government as a core partner. And we're having sets of collaboratives really speak to how they've engaged the government, challenges, what's worked, what's not. But just to do in our dipstick here, we found that 10 out of the 13 are in fact working closely with government. But the way that they're working with the government, and these were not mutually exclusive again. So some were doing partnerships, they're co-implementing, some are advising on policy, some are just getting MOUs to work in systems. So I'd like to just, invite our sets of collaboratives that will speak to how they've been working with the government. And that is Paresh, Shailaja, Srinivas, Vidya, and Shashanka. Welcome to our little government huddle. And all of you will see in our little corner, that is Santosh, our artist, who is illustrating hopefully what is a learning conversation, but you'll see these illustrations emerge and capture the thoughts that each of us are putting here, and we'll share that with you post the session. But welcome everyone to quick flash rounds of what does it take to work with the government, what's worked, what's not. Paresh, you are perhaps, and I mean this with the utmost respect, one of the elders in this, trying to do collaboratives. So we'll have you kick us off.
I thought I would have deferred to Vidya, but since you gave me the opportunity, let me go. I guess one of the key themes that emerged as I looked at the title of this session itself, Neera, is what does it take to really work with governments in a manner that leads to systems change? I think if I pick up that theme, and I think there are multiple layers that we can really peel as we go along. So I'll just make some opening thoughts, share some opening thoughts, Neera, and then maybe come back to some of these later. I guess when we talk about engagement with government, I think at the Pirambil Foundation, we've really seen multiple models evolve. And I'm just going to touch upon those and leave those thoughts again for the audience to think through. I think we have seen public-private partnerships in the classical sense, where nonprofits have worked as service providers on government programs on a dimension that the government has defined very, very sharply. If I look at the next level, it's really what we have called public-private philanthropic partnerships, where the government is not bringing in necessarily all the funding, but philanthropists and governments are coming together to really drive government programs, government agendas, and government objectives, and national priorities. I think the third one, which is really the subject matter of our discussion today, is multi-stakeholder collaboratives, which really brings so many different partners to a table that we get different perspectives, not just funders, not just government, not just implementing organizations, but knowledge partners, technology partners, thought leaders, policymakers, that I think we approach an issue, a field much more holistically than possibly what public-private partnerships or public-private philanthropic partnerships can achieve. I think one of the things that we've seen is as we look at collaboratives, I think our ability to define a unique proposition, a single vision, a common objective that all of us can really gravitate around. When we talk about it in the context of the Tribal Health Collaborative, which is one of the things that Neera, you referred to, I think our ability to link it to the sustainable development goals that India has signed up for becomes really a unifying call for all stakeholders to come together to really drive what we believe can be the common agenda for all of us to gravitate around. I think the third thought I'm going to leave with you is when we talk about engagement with government and how do we engage with governments, there are people who will say it has to be bottom up, some who will say it has to be top down, and all kinds of models exist. But I think the one theme to my mind that runs across, irrespective of the nature of our engagement with government, is as civil society, as non-profits who are really engaged with communities, our ability to build convergence. And when I say convergence, it is convergence within the government, across, in the Indian context, across a block, a district, a state, and a center. Our ability to build convergence across ministries, because we see multiple programs where the implementing agency is different from a policy-making ministry. And how do we drive that convergence? Nutrition is a classical example in the Indian context, right? Between women and child development and health and family welfare. And convergence of objectives across multiple stakeholders who are coming to the table. I think those are some of the elements that I just thought I would leave with as some opening thoughts as to how does one really engage with governments. We can come back to talking about challenges and how to make this much more effective. But let me just pause there, Neera, and hand this back to you.
Great. No, thanks, Paresh. I'm going to bounce straight to you, Shailaja, and if I can ask you and others to build, right? Agree. Have you felt the same perspective, experience in the collaboratives that you're running? I know for a fact, Shailaja, that we have definitely looked at this challenge and opportunity of convergence. But please go ahead, Shailaja.
Sure. just taking a step back from what Paresh mentioned, I'll come back to one of his points. I wanted to mention an additional piece on really our understanding of what's helpful to the government through the work of the 10 to 19 Adolescents Collaborative. And one of the things I realize is that, earlier there was a traditional model of working groups where the government would go to a working committee, get some input advice, and think about policy reform or structuring policies. Increasingly, there is an appetite for the government, if you look at the local government, state government, central government, to get a set of recommendations which are in an aggregated manner, so not driven by one organization or one funder or one agenda. The fact that is agnostic, again, divergent from specific agendas, that it brings together a multi-stakeholder point of view, and again, not just one, just civil society or just a funder point of view. And this entire piece together, which is aggregated, agnostic, multi-stakeholder, and one that includes the voice or the perspective of the community, then gives them a sense of sustainable solutions. And that's really one of the unique pieces in what a collaborative is able to bring to the government repeatedly, and therefore also the need for the collaborative to do that. That's one at a kind of agenda setting level. The second piece is really some of the changes in the government appetite that we've seen post-COVID because of the vulnerabilities being exacerbated. So again, traditionally or conventionally, the way our civil society sector used to work is you gather funds, you implement a program for 5 years, you do this robust evaluation at the end, and then you take it to the government or back to the funding agency to say this is the way we can scale up. However, increasingly, looking at kind of micro problems and micro solutions and hyper-local solutions, there is again the ability of the collaborative to curate those solutions, get it vetted by a set of practitioners. And so we don't have to follow the long drawn-out chain of lots of resources and time and energy, but we can take this up at a very rapid level. And for example, one of the things we've been able to do, I'm giving this as an example, is to take something very quickly within the time frame of the year to the government, all the way from a district level innovation to the national, because we are moving away from the mindset of doing very detailed assessments. Rapid assessments, quick solutions, innovations, and vetting is what's required. So I'll pause there and look at the others responding to.
Yeah, Shailaja, can I just ask you a follow-up, just because I think this is useful to chat about. How has the government changed or looked at the role of the community, or who you're ultimately, trying to address with these sets of outcomes?
Yeah, I think that's a great point also, and one that Paresh picked up when he was talking about the bottoms up, and there are different ways. The trickle up effect is what we've been calling it. There's definitely now the need and almost a mandate that we see that the government is asking for and following and signaling to all of the stakeholders to include the voice of community members, of the participants or constituents that we're working with in a much more formal way. Taking the example of the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, not only are they looking at convergence across ministries? Again, like Paresh mentioned, we have the school health program, which is across the Ministry of Health, as well as education, within which there is a carved out role called the messengers, which is for the young people to be a part of the program. And one of the pieces that I want to just end with here is to say, a lot of the times what we do is work with our communities to get their input, recommendations, advice. But now it's also time, once we look at those policy enforcements, to go back to the community to be equal implementers as well as be equal monitors of this, to look at some of these assessments. And the government is looking and open at how can we do this in a constructive way.
Great, thanks, Shailaja. I'm going to come to you, Srinivas, if you're agreeing, seeing similarities, anything quite different from your experience in engaging with the government.
No, so I think I kind of resonate with what both Paresh and Shailaja said. I think so we need to bear in mind a few things, and particularly the point I think Shailaja made, right, about the fact that timeframes have to be crunched. I think one factor we need to recognize is government work on political cycles, right? And typically political cycles in India tend to be 5 years. So as and I can give you some examples of some of the engagements we've had. So governments are under pressure to show impact. And so obviously they also would want our programs, to be able to demonstrate impact fairly quickly. And then, we kind of replicate and move that forward, across other districts or other states and so on. We are already seeing, we are one of the relatively younger collaboratives. We've been around for 2 years, but we can, based on the work we are doing with about 2 or 3 state governments, we can see that they're fairly quick to recognize, impact. They're not waiting for the long run, but are willing to move forward fairly quickly.
Do you want to just share a bit of your collaborative, Srinivas? Because I must admit it's thanks to Ravi that it was highlighted to us and we did the litmus test and it passed. We found that a lot of us perhaps don't see ourselves actually as collaboratives. Does the government see you as a platform in the same way perhaps that Shailaja was describing?
Yes. So if you look at the way we've tried to do things, and I can talk specific examples, but in the interest of time. So what we are trying to do is work at policy level. So for example, how do we make the environment for entrepreneurship, let's a little easier? For example, specifically around areas like ease of doing business, etc. So we've brought in a bunch of partners. So we've brought in people who've got strong, who bring in knowledge and prior experience. We've brought in people who worked at very senior levels in the government, who understand the inside workings of government. We've set up what we call task forces, which are essentially a partnership of civil society, academia, entrepreneurs, entrepreneurship development organizations, and governments have seen value in terms of how we bring all these different strands of thought together, and also obviously align the right kind of implementation partners to go out and actually deliver tangible outcomes in a fairly short span of time.
Great, thanks, Srinivas. I just want to encourage my scientists, I'm calling you, to check out the chats. There are some questions specifically for a few of you, so feel free to engage and listen. I'm going to come to you now, Vidya, to get your perspective on how it's been working with the government.
Thanks, Neera. I think we're speaking specifically of one of the 5 collaboratives that ADK was engaged in, which is the Collaborators for Transforming Education. And it's a program that is about 5 years old now, that we started in 2016. But it took a year of almost co-curation with the government. And I think, in a sense, it was a fairly interesting time of co-creating, because while you may have very similar objectives in terms of improving learning levels in government schools, especially in terms of the districts in which we work with are really what they call euphemistically special focus districts, which is really the Nandurbar and Amravati, Parbhani, Gadchiroli kind of area in Maharashtra. There's not necessarily 100% alignment of objectives. And sometimes because of political pressures, governments can, sort of veer off track and want to do something in addition or different. And therefore the co-creation process is one of some amount of conflict as well. And I think resolving that at an early stage is very important. And therefore it took us almost a year to just, sort of come to an agreement on what we wanted to get established on the ground. I think obviously the other process of building the collaborative involved implementing partners on the ground and, and other partners as well. Funding partners as well. But I think there are 2 or 3 things that we focused on, and thankfully on that one big objective, which was really strengthening state capacity, not supplementing, but strengthening state capacity, I think there was complete agreement. And I think strengthening state capacity is a very, it's a very complicated thing because like Paresh and I think Shelja also mentioned, it has a lot of stuff that has been established for decades, if not a century, a couple of centuries in India in terms of how the education system, which are largely driven by politics, and there's very little you can do there. But the two other areas where you can really influence and nudge more than change overnight is really practice and behavior. And therefore, a lot of the work that our partners, and I hate to call them implementing partners because they're the guys on the ground, and it includes Kaivalya Education Foundation and Quest and Gyan Prakash, their whole attempt has been to work with, state administrative cadre across the board, right from village to district, to really nudge behavior and do it through demonstration. And that's why it takes time, because you're trying to change decades old practice of either the way teaching is done in class or the way schools are managed or the way parents involve themselves in the schools, and so many other nuances that actually lead to our children learning. So I think the learnings I've had is that if you want to build or strengthen state capacity, there's so much you can do on policy, but you have to focus more on practice and behavior through demonstration. And the second thing I've learned is make the government the winner all the time, show the government to be the winner all the time. That is incredibly important. You have to genuinely walk the talk of modesty and, sort of framing the solution around what the government has achieved rather than what the government has not been able to do. And that's incredibly important to have continued support. This is beyond, the governance of the collaborative and, the structure of it. I think the behavior of the collaborative, of all the actors in that collaborative, has to be that we want the children to learn and we want government to look good. And genuinely look good, not in a, sort of a PR sort of way. And to really enable that, and there are so many great mechanisms by which that happens, right? Because when you make a district, say, an SCRT official look good in front of the education secretary, it is actually win-win for everybody. And I think this is something that's really important if you want to have a long-term relationship on building state capacity.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Vidya. There's some questions on the chat that are actually directed towards you, but a great point on an important part of the collaborative and strengthening state capacity. And just as I come to you, Shashanka, sometimes it does feel that as collaboratives, we may be interfering with agendas and relationships and legacies of organizations themselves. And I know that, the alliance that you lead, we do have a certain construct towards what Srinivas was saying, task forces and things, but if you can maybe speak to how has it been able to overcome what might seem as interfering in each other's space, but also speak a bit to, obviously your experience with the government.
Thanks, Meera. So I'll start a little bit with the context of what we do. So we are the National Fecal Sludge and Septage Management Alliance. That's a mouthful. We work in sanitation, and we are trying to bring attention to an important part of sanitation, which should be prioritized, because sanitation is essentially a resource-constrained sector. So we are trying to tell everybody who's caring to listen that we should have a certain priority area and focus on that, so that you get 100% coverage, basic sanitation coverage. So that's the core focus of what we're trying to do. And we've been actually very lucky, extremely lucky in how our alliance has come together, partly because a lot of our partners were already embedded with governments. So we had like 5 or 6 different state governments where individual partners were embedded. And so these came together, and then another 20, 25 other partners came together from, like Pareshji was saying, multi-stakeholder, widely multi-stakeholder. So we had CPR, who was policy oriented. We had NIUA and CEPT University and so on and so forth, academics and capacity building experts. So, and we had hardcore technology people coming in, couple of them. So we had a very broad incoming set of people, organizations, and this made us into a unit which was, um, to Srinivasji's point, very flexible and very responsive to the government's needs, because we could pull in, different things and package a product and provide it very quickly. So that was a good thing for us, right? So Srinivasji, actually, you're saying political cycles of 5 years. The pressures in our case, because it's infrastructure and scheme driven, every state is at a different point in the scheme, and they have to spend funds, right? So the fund spending actually drives the pressures. So different partners come under different pressures at different times. So those are things which we have to react to and support. So just building on what you were saying, I think a large part of where we have been able to help governments is with codified knowledge, what Shailaja was talking about earlier. Um, Codified knowledge in the form of, I wouldn't say canned, but like developing a set of training materials, developing very simple IEC material and so on, right? A lot of codification of knowledge and being able to provide it in a timely manner. That's where we've been successful. But the other thing that we've been doing well, I think, is being opportunistic in engaging with government, watching the trends very closely. So if the 15th Finance Commission is about to meet, you bang the door down somehow, get inside and talk about fecal sludge management. And, in this case, it worked. In some cases, it didn't work, but at least we tried. So similarly with the Niti Aayog, they wanted to talk about business models in sanitation, which in itself is a misnomer and an oxymoron. But we did help them put together a package, and we did do that very quickly. The good thing was that this package got published, and so it's available with 4,000 cities now. The not so great thing was our line ministry didn't like that we went to another ministry. So there are downsides to being very reactive and responsive, and having this pure purpose without you got to be a bit more nuanced when it comes to government. So government, the word is a big word, but it is very nuanced and very, you got to slice and dice it and look at it in different ways. And one of those slicing and dicing, to me, which stands out very critically, is governments have champions embedded in them at various levels, in various positions, and these champions are whom we either search for or we get lucky and work with, and those relationships are very critical to getting things done. What earlier we had discussed about demonstrations, because without the on-ground demonstrations, you don't have common mental models. Without common mental models, you don't get the scale. So this progression needs to happen with champions, and champions have to be within government, right? So that's the other thing about personalities and relationships. So these three things: multi-stakeholder approach, codifying knowledge, and personality and relationship driven demonstration of things on ground are, to me, that's how we engage with government.
Yeah, thanks, Shashanka. Srinivas, do you want to add anything? I just see that you've unmuted. Do you?
No, I think kind of a lot of what Shashanka said is what I think we've tried to follow in practice, which is when you start an engagement, make sure you put together a strong collaborative, define objectives up front. We've tried to ensure we get funding in place, which ensures there's a strong focus on outcomes, and obviously finding the right champions, and obviously change in the government occurs better when first you build a relationship at the top, and then you work your way through at all levels. Just having a relationship at the top doesn't work. You need to, build relationships at all levels, because ultimately, for example, who's interacting with an entrepreneur in a small, in a small block, right? It's not the chief secretary of the state. It's somebody else. So figuring out how to get the collaborator to work with all these stakeholders at different levels, and ensuring, I think I just wanted to add what Vidya said, which is making sure that every success should be amplified as the government success, right? And we should tend to, kind of lie low and let them take all the credit. I think that works very well.
Great, great. So thank you. Prayesh, you want to give one more minute, and then
Yes,
we'll.
I think just to build on what I think both Vidya and Shashank spoke about, I think the value of demonstration, champions, and so the use of data. And I'm just kind of dilating that point. I think the use of data in how decision making happens within the government, we have seen from our experiences, Neera, is so critical. I think today that is one of the biggest challenges. We will talk about challenges, but I think how can we use data to really influence policy, program design, or the way government should use its money? The second dimension I just want to bring in is, again, I think Shashank spoke about codified knowledge. Beyond codified knowledge, how do we really create what I would call open source public goods? What we are building, what we are creating, whether it is knowledge, whether it is technology tools, whether it is assets of any kind, how do we really make those available as open source and as public good is, I think, extremely critical from a government standpoint. I can't really go out and say this is my IP and so I will monetize it, but in a philanthropic kind of a partnership with the government, helping build that public good, which can then become a platform across the country, is something which I just thought I would leave with you. Thank you.
Great, yeah, thank you. So I'm going to have a few of you back for, actually most of you back for either the session in looking at funding or the session in implementing partners. And so please build on this. So thank you for sharing the comments on how it's been to work with the government. I'm going to pull Olivia in for just your thoughts as you hear this group speaking to their challenges, what's worked, what's not, and you will also see hopefully maybe where Santosh is in capturing some of the conversation. But yeah, just what as you were listening to this group, what are some thoughts you have?
Yeah, so I had a few thoughts, and also looking at the chat, which was also really interesting, and to hear this really rich discussion. I think I'd say a few things. So first is I saw that there was a bit of a discussion both amongst everyone as well as in the chat around the role of individuals. And I think the reflection I had here was that, yes, it's about the individuals and it's about the champions. And at the same time, it's also about how do these changes actually really get embedded in the system so that it's not just reliant on specific individuals and champions. And I think that's a lot of where that kind of collaborative work comes in, is how to do that. So I think that was one reflection that I had. And the second was the point that was made around government needing to be seen as and to be the change maker and with others, so that it's not about sort of a collaborative trying to come together and government is separate, but really sort of being part of and actually looking at that, I think, is so key. And I know that was mentioned a number of times, and I think really important also when it comes to the point of really the success being something that then government fully takes on as well. And then the final point, which was discussed a bit, was on this question of metrics and how do we actually really see the impact. And I think it comes back to a little bit of also what gets people hooked in doing this work and supporting this work and working with government is actually being able to see what this means. This goes back again to what is it and the why, which is really about the ability to see this at scale and kind of system wide. And so I think there's a whole conversation that can be had around how do you track that? How do you track that at a systems level? How do you look at questions of political economy within that? And so, but I think that was an additional thing that was raised here that I think is really important.
Great, thanks, Olivia. So we'll move on to our next segment, which is, how do collaboratives work with funders? What's worked, what's not? Let's just flash up what were some themes that emerged, at least from this captive group. Was, to no surprise, majority, 8 out of the 11, were largely funded by international organizations. So perhaps something more than anything else is really building domestic philanthropy to engage in collaboratives is something we just need to strengthen. And given the regulations and where we are as a sector, this is needed perhaps even more. It just gives us more flexibility. And a lot of what we've been speaking to at Dasra Philanthropy Week are families and family philanthropy, and how can families begin to engage in collaboratives adds a whole new dimension, right? There's a family member sitting next to a professional. Is there a dynamic there that plays into these collaborative constructs? Then again, here we have most of them are institutional funders, few, coming in as corporates. But this is just very quickly, the dipstick. And so let me invite Prita, Amita, Shailaja, Priya, and Paresh back to, let's chat about the sense of what you've learned. And we're going to kick off. I think we're all coming into our spotlight. We're just waiting for Paresh to come on in. All right, there we go. And Prita, we're starting with you to just share, how has it been, and a little bit about your collaborative, specifically around funders.
Sure, thanks, Neera. So I'm going to be talking about the Pay What It Takes collective that was set up formally last year. Although, as Neera kindly alluded, we have done a more sweeping knowledge study of collaboratives in India. But for the purpose of this conversation, I'll wear the hat of just looking at the learnings about funder interactions and practices on the Pay What It Takes collaborative.
Can you just speak just a little louder? Yeah, please.
Sure.
Thanks.
So on the collaborative, just as context, we have 3 foreign funders, the Ford Foundation, SIF, that's the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, and Omidyar Network, and 2 domestic foundations, Edelgift Foundation, and we have Vidya here with us as well, and ATE Chandra Foundation. So some of the key learnings, and in the interest of time, I'll keep to 2 or 3 learnings that we had. I think the first and biggest learning for us is that we should not look at funders as just dispensers of cash or funds, but to look at them more holistically, because a lot of them bring not just funding to the table, but also the power of their voice. So the networks they bring, the influence they bring to actually shape impact at a scaled up level is very critical. So as we were looking at a mix of funders, we not just looked at those who might necessarily bring a certain amount of funding to the collaborative, but also those who can really enable change for the goal and vision of the collaborative. So I think that was definitely our first learning. The second one was about what really is the motivation or the legacy that each of these funders want to leave behind. And there we realized, and I'm sure all of you are painfully aware, that almost everyone around this table are doing collaboratives unless they are the backbone of it as an addition to their day jobs. So if you look at Paresh, like, just as an example, he's doing the Tribal Health Collaborative in addition to a whole raft of responsibilities he has at Piramal Foundation. And similarly with multiple examples of leaders who are doing this. So we really tried to probe into what is the legacy or motivation for them. And we found that those who really invest time and resources on a collaborative are those that want to cause systems or field level change. So to really put in that additional time and money beyond their programmatic work, beyond their foundations work, to create scaled impact on nation building. And that is critical for the funders to come around the table and stay around the table. The third and final one we found was that the same things don't motivate all funders. We, of course, at Britspan, because of our founding bias, have a very strong primary research data bias. But really, funders can be kind of motivated both with head and heart. And the percentage of what influences funders both to invest and to sustain the impact of the collaborative can really vary. So the same messages or the same work of the collaborative, we often have to, if I might use that crude word, package to the funders interested based on what works for them? Is it data or hard evidence that causes them to invest more? Or is it really looking at, videos of that poor child who doesn't have good health and education, whereas they have, in reality, as equal rights as any citizen of India? And really, for us, that was where the penny dropped as we are looking at systems change for pay what it takes in the collective. So I'll pause there with those kind of three main learnings we have experienced.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Pritha. I'm going to come to you, Amita, with your experience. Anything resonate with what Pritha might have just shared or not? Just build, please. Yeah.
I mean, absolutely, everything. But, since we're one of the younger collaboratives, I'm going to do a quick ICC intro for everybody. For those of you who don't know us, the India Climate Collaborative was the first climate-focused collaboration to be set up in India. And it was actually launched just last year by some of India's leading philanthropists. The goal is very specific, but also quite broad, which is to scale impact capital in India towards climate solutions. And one of the reasons why we felt like collaboration was sort of needed to be a fundamental premise of our work was that when we started conceiving of, collective climate action, we saw that there was this widespread perception that climate change was going to drive away attention from the things that truly mattered to people on the ground, especially in developing countries like India, who just cannot afford that, right? But the reality we were all seeing, most of us coming from development sector backgrounds, not climate backgrounds actually, is that climate isn't waiting for us to develop. And with that comes the destructive consequences on lives and livelihoods. So we have to figure out this way to kind of do things at the same time. We have to invest in ways to produce double, triple wins, that sort of sweet spot of co-benefits where climate and development goes hand in hand, where we can get, like Neera said, in the short and long term to the 1 billion thriving. So we knew our work would need to be collaborative to really be able to span these concerns. And there was, so many challenges that we confronted over the past 3 years. I wanted to talk about them because, as Shailaja said, it's easy to talk about learnings, but it's harder to talk about the challenges. But I think one of the main reasons we felt equipped to tackle them early on was that we interviewed over 35 Indian and international collaboratives before we even started designing our own. And I'm grateful to many of the people on this call because they were part of that. And I'm also very supportive of the Learning Lab idea. So for me, the three challenges that I chose also are reflected in some of the best advice I heard from that exercise. The first one is heightened, and I think this is one that hasn't been mentioned yet, heightened funder dynamics. So we often talk about the fact that a collaborative is as successful as, its goals are clearly defined. But their benefits and drawbacks to that, one definitely being that having too narrow a focus means that you create a funder collaborative basically means instituting a gatekeeper to the funding community in that sector, right? And you can create winners and losers in the grantee community based on those who fit the strategy and those who don't. For us as an ecosystem as nascent as climate change is, there was no benefit to having like a narrow pool, which is why we are classified as not having implementing partners. We needed 1,000 flowers to bloom, as we say. And we started with a philosophy of being a big tent. So like Pritha mentioned, we didn't distinguish between funders who are big or small. We also didn't distinguish between partners who were, more policy, more grassroots implementation, et cetera. And this also meant knowing that the ecosystem needed a non-project approach, right? It needed an ability to keep pulling back and taking a look at the sector and the actors and the blind spots and updating that needs assessment, which has continued being really important 3 years into building the ICC. The second is this feeling of needing to be everything for everyone. So we're aware that no amount of philanthropic funding can by itself solve climate change. So we really need to look at a diverse group of funding actors, not just implementing actors. And something Pritha said really resonated, which is that, somebody put it to me once that your product can be the same, but your customer service for different funders has to be different. And you have to think really strategically about how to do that in a way that really makes your issue their issue or their issue your issue. And one very great piece of advice I got was that, no decisions are made at the meeting. So by being a collaborative, you need to bring everybody together and give everyone the feeling they're working towards the same goal. But the pre-work and the post-work is everything. That's where you eke out the challenges of trying to build a coalition of apples and oranges and, all kinds of other fruit and tailor the support and resources that different actors require. And the last one is speed and stickiness. So we knew we needed the same organizations who we were investing in taking along this learning journey and this collaborative journey to stick around with us and increase ambition, guide others who are coming on later. And a great piece of advice I got early on was, not everything has been said until everyone has said it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can create forums for people to say it, to let people say it. They need the experience of figuring it out, figuring out how to really come on board. I can definitely say that's true of the funder community. But one of the questions we ask ourselves is, how do you create that experience, but at a pace that meets the urgency of the issue, right? We're still really figuring that out. But one practical answer to the stickiness issue was governance. We started with a group of funders who, like I said, co-created the ICC with us and mandate and agenda. But most importantly, this group continues to be a guiding and advisory force for us that we convene often and ensure stay true to our mandate. So we have a process that kind of brings us back home to what it means to be a collaborative.
We should probably learn from your process and share it with others. I can imagine some of our funders on this call nodding their heads saying, yeah, we probably should have done that better. But in that light, I'm going to move to you, Shailaja. Then Priya, I know you're there. I'll come to you and then I'll come to you, Paresh. Yeah, so Shailaja, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just going to say a few things, and thanks for the speakers who spoke before. The 10 to 19 collaborative is one of the unique collaboratives that wasn't started by a funder. We didn't have kind of a parent funder. And really the idea was to be impact led based on what the communities needed. And for us, the community is the constituent is the adolescent health and well-being. It's complex. So in that, our learning has really been, and this is much more exacerbated now with COVID as well. And Preeta, I'm going to borrow from the collaborative report, The Power of Many, which is the collaborative conundrum. We see a lot of investment nowadays, having the mandate, when you're giving proposals, RFPs, looking at, does your organization collaborate with the government, with other organizations? So that is something that is looked at a lot. However, I would like to challenge and think about how are each of us, and in that the funder community as well, how are we defining collaboration and holding ourselves accountable as well? So it has to go both ways, right? What is the definition of collaboration? It's not a binary definition. Are you being more or less collaborative is where we're coming from. So how are we really trying to enable that? How are we defining that? How are we measuring that? Because to be honest, what the mandate is to collaborate, but then the indicators are to look at the change in the lives of the communities. So that's a whole host of things that a collaborative needs to do. So one needs to understand, if you're talking about focus, also there's this large mandate. That's one. And secondly, just coming back to the communities is, with COVID, it's becoming increasingly difficult to involve community-based organizations that are closest to the grounds in such a large agenda. How are we creating the space for not those very smart organizations, for not those very well-versed organizations with the hierarchy? Amita, you mentioned, what is the gatekeeping that we are enabling through some of the mandates and the governance of the collaborative? Because then what we'll end up is in a loop that each of us are speaking to each of us and congratulating ourselves in this circle. How are we ensuring that we're listening to the voice of the communities and looking at the sustainable solutions? Because without their voice, we're not going to enable it. So these are the two thoughts I thought I would just place here to challenge the funder participation in the collaboration, and that the backbone organizations like ourselves need to hold ourselves accountable to come up with solutions around that.
Great, thanks, Shailaja. Priya, if you're there, please go ahead. I know you can't turn your video on, but let's have your voice lean in.
Thanks, Neera. And just to build on, I think everyone that went before me, right? So just to sort of Revive is a blended finance facility, which was set up in collaboration with USAID, the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, their network, UNDP, the British High Commission, and many, many companies and social organizations. And Shailaja, to your point, it was a combination of very large, but also very small organizations, each one committed to improving the livelihood outcomes of about 100,000 individuals and micro enterprises that were impacted by COVID. Now that itself is sort of a mouthful. And we really had 5 guiding principles, so to speak. One, we needed to be responsive to the needs of those that were impacted. And even the cohorts that we've supported in the last 5-6 months range from salt pan workers, women micro entrepreneurs, farmers, construction workers, micro contractors, retailers, which meant that the solutions we create needed to be responsive to a diverse set of needs of everyone who had been impacted at the same time, but in very, very different ways. The second thing that we were cognizant of is that while we started out with relief, we needed to rapidly move towards recovery and growth. And that, yes, while COVID had impacted a lot of these individuals, the reality is that they were facing structural barriers much before and would continue to do so. And if anything, it was just exacerbated, right? So it wasn't enough for us to just think of the response here and now, but just be cognizant of how we were going to respond in the long term as well. Also use different financial instruments. Just give me 1 second. The third one was that we needed to use different financial instruments, grants, returnable grants, first loss default guarantees, pay for performance structures. And this was critical for many different reasons. One, that different people were impacted differently. Sanitation workers, for example, were very vulnerable and needed grants, whereas street vendors and nano enterprises who were hardworking individuals didn't need charity, but could use returnable grants. Micro enterprises actually needed access to working capital, but banks weren't willing to lend, interest rates were out of whack. And then because Samhita worked with corporates, we also wanted to focus on shared value. And the last one was that we needed to be partner-led and partner-driven. Now, in the mix of all of this, even the kind of funders that came together were very, very diverse. So there were bilateral organizations like USAID and the British High Commission, multilateral such as UNDP, global foundations, such as MSDF and Omidyar Network, and many different kinds of companies that wanted to support their own, those that were agnostic and wanted to fund the most vulnerable, and those that really wanted to create more catalytic change for their own ecosystem. Each of these funders had different requirements. Some wanted to fund certain communities, others could only use certain instruments. Others kind of wanted to use their grants for specific reasons, so skilling versus working capital. Some had a focus on monitoring and evaluation. Others were interested in the data that was coming out. And then each one also saw a very different role that they wanted to champion. So some wanted to use their COVID response budgets very, very quickly. And their metric for success is how quickly were we responding to communities and how quickly were they able to bounce back. Others wanted to test out new instruments, such as the returnable grants that we rolled out for the first time and at scale. A lot of our corporates were, fantastic, because what they said is that they didn't just want to respond to communities impacted by COVID, but they wanted to change their processes and policies to ensure that they stay committed to the long-term resilience and recovery. And so, as we kind of thought through these multiple funders and the different priorities that they had, we very easily could have said, hey, wait a minute, these are conflicting priorities. But I think, maybe the success that we've seen, if I may say so, is really that there was a lot of strength in this diversity. And we very quickly went from a single instrument, a single response collaborative to a blended finance continuum.
Yeah.
And that's really allowed us to do one thing really, really well, which is we've been able to combine different instruments using different funder sort of support to respond very holistically to the specific challenges that each of our communities wanted, right? Great. So if I were to kind of if I would end with saying that what really helped us was that the secret of collaboration was actually customization. And it wasn't just customization per funder, but the customization happened based on the specific beneficiary needs. And I thought that, that was, at least in my mind, the one thing that we did well.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Priya. Sorry, I had to cut you off. I just need to keep us tight on time. So Paresh, please go ahead.
Thanks, Neera. I think when Amita says that it's a young collaborative, I don't know what one would call the tribal health collaborative. We are going to be launched in April. We're working with the government in kind of moving towards that milestone. And I'm saying it's just a milestone because it's a long journey. But I think I'm not going to repeat what the other speakers have shared. I think when we talk about funding, we end up thinking about funding purely as to what's coming in from philanthropists, foundations, CSR, international donors, and so on and so forth. I think one of our key learnings in the aspirational districts, NERA, over the last 3 years, and we've worked in 25 of these, is our ability to leverage funding that is available within the government. All of us know that what we are putting in all together is maybe less than 10%, if not lesser, of what the government is putting into these various sectors. I think I would really go out there and say that over the last 3 years in health and education, in 25 districts that we have worked in, we would have leveraged almost $100 million worth of government funding into improvement of service delivery, whether it was in education and healthcare. Now, that doesn't mean the money comes to the collaborative, but the fact that money is getting utilized far, far better than what it was earlier. And today, I think with the kind of devolution that's happening from the center to the Panchayati Raj, to the local government organizations, I think our ability to identify those pockets of funding that are available, there are programs, but many a times the district collector does not know how to utilize that funding. And it's then helping her really carve out programs and campaigns where that can be utilized very effectively. So I think the point that I'm making is besides external funding that's coming into the government programs, how does one leverage the government funding itself? I think that's one point. The second one, I guess, everyone talked about the fact that different funders come with different theories of change, and our ability to stitch that together, whether it is geographically, thematically, to come up with, again, what that unified vision is a given. I think one of the things that we have seen as we have worked through our Tribal Health Collaborative NERA is many of funders, and especially the initial core funders, as we call them, are coming in not just with the funding, but are coming with deep technical expertise and knowledge. Whether it is on maternal and child health, whether it is on nutrition, whether it is on tuberculosis, whether it is on perinatal health, I think that deep technical expertise, how does one marry that along with the funding to make the collaborative a lot more robust? This is not a funders collaborative. So if we are really looking at SDG level systemic changes, I think that expertise is also something that we've seen is extremely critical as we build our solution.
Great, thank you, Paresh. Any closing comments for that?
Yeah, one thing I'd like to really elevate, borrowing a term from one of the stakeholders, that we're working with on a collaborative said, this has to really be a joy of collaboration as opposed to a burden of collaboration. And, whilst it sounds a bit cliched, it has such a strong undercurrent of truth, because what gives joy to different funders to collaborate is really, again, multifaceted. And 2 or 3 things that really came up is one, given this is long-term change, we're not going to achieve change in 2-3 years, let alone 5-6, right? It's a decade-plus journey in most of the collaborative's vision. One needs to really have milestones or progress, communicate what the 10 to 19 is trying to do in terms of, say, an impact narrative. So, to communicate to funders that there is progress towards those long-term vision, which are tricky and vexatious, I think is critical. And the second one, I think many speakers alluded to it, is the trust building. So funders should actually find positive energy and joy of coming to those meetings to learn from each other and contribute. But if they come to it feeling that it's a burden, then it's not going to stick. So I would really underline the joy of collaboration as we kind of sign off this segment.
Yeah, great, Pritha. Amita, I have a couple of minutes if you want to take 1 or 2 minutes, and we can transition to the next segment. Go ahead.
Neera, do you want me to do any kind of closing comments, or what would you like me to do?
Yeah. Just after hearing folks, things on the chat, anything else you want to add or resonated or not? I have a minute to give you before I move to the next group. I know you're not coming back into the next segment, so I wanted to give you that extra or two.
I mean, I think one of the main points that came out from multiple people that I didn't hit on, but I think is very important for the ICC and has been in our design, is looking at funders not as vehicles for funding. I think that's both an approach that helps in being able to engage funders, but genuinely is a truth in the way that we designed the collaborative. And so for folks who are looking to join collaboratives or even set up collaboratives, I think the funder-based collaboratives, the biggest lesson I think I've learned is to give people a chance to participate before they have to put anything on the table. That's often gotten us the most engaged, support and the longest lasting partnerships, because those really are trust-based, right? You're giving people a chance to see whether there is joy in this collaboration. I know that's worked for us, and it's been a big learning.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for this segment on funding. Everyone meaning my scientists in the lab, and we'll have our head researcher scientist, Olivia, give us, her thoughts while we see what Santosh has been able to draw on from our comments before we move on to the next segment. Olivia.
Thanks, Neera, and thanks everyone. So I won't repeat because now I'm taking to heart the nothing has been said until everybody has said it. So I won't do that, which I think is a good thing for all of us. But the one reflection I had, which is, I think the point was made multiple times about the benefits of why actually you would have funders come together and what it looks like and how you need to do it. But I think ultimately the reality is that collaboration, certainly both in terms of funders coming together and also funding in a way that really does encourage collaboration and being part of it, is still very much not the norm. And I think here we're seeing some amazing examples of it. And certainly we have some all over the world, but it still isn't generally the way. So oftentimes when you see funders collaborate, it tends to be, I'm doing this, you're doing that, let's talk, rather than let's actually really deeply look at how we can come together and maybe also give up some of the things of our theory of change or our control or those sorts of elements. And so I think ultimately it's why. And so absolutely some of it is about the joy, but I really think it's two things. One is it's about the scale of the impact that you can have by coming together and the fact that you actually really can do things that are longer term, that you can really see much more, and coming back to the billion thriving, you need to come together to do it rather than being individual funders. And then the second piece is really the coherence that can provide, rather than often what we see with funders, which is I've got my theory of change, as was discussed multiple times, you have yours, let's therefore bring that to the table. But really, how can you as funders come together, put the partners that you're supporting really at the center, and say how is it that you actually can try to provide that coherence by coming together, rather than saying we're funding this and you that. And I think ultimately you get hooked on that because you can start to see the impact that happens as a result of taking that kind of an approach.
Great, thank you, Olivia. So we're going to move on to our next segment, which is really around how do we extend our partnerships to include those who are implementing directly, or even how we're bringing knowledge partners into this. And just some summary thoughts for us to look at. 7 out of the 13 implement their own programs, as well as facilitating implementation. Again, here, not mutually exclusive. So I might implement my own plus facilitate, and some actually do not engage at all. And all 13 are in this around knowledge, trying to develop learnings. And I think that comes from a bit of what we, kicked off some of the conversation, and how do we codify and really bring our learnings to the sector to just accelerate some of that impact. So without too much delay, if I can just invite folks to come on in, Lakshmi, Ashif, Priya, Shashanka, and Vidya. And similar to our other conversations, let's just kick off with Lakshmi. How has it been in terms of the collaborative you're running and being able to engage in these partnerships?
Thank you, Neera. So just a quick introduction to Samohika Shakti, and coming from the funder conversation, it's a bit different in that we are funded by a single organization, a single donor, but we do have multiple implementing partners, which means that it's for us, collaboration is all about working with our partners and to make sure they're able to work together in a collaborative way. So I think for a few things that have worked, we are relatively young, we're in the second year, but I can just share what has worked so far. I think what's worked so far is a strong alignment among all of our partners on what needs to be done. And that what needs to be done is our common agenda, a shared vision, the outcomes and the strategies that we will use towards achieving those, towards achieving that common vision. But there's a lot of independence on how that needs to be achieved. There is a lot of space that's been provided for the partners to bring in their expertise. And that's really helped, particularly in light of how the last year has been with so many uncertainties, COVID, regulatory changes, FCRA, and so on. What that gives the partners the space to do is to bring in their expertise and pivot. And so that really builds a huge environment of trust and transparency among the partners and helps them work well together. I think, and also what's worked, Olivia mentioned this very early on, is that collaboration takes time. This is so commitment, a long-term commitment from the donor definitely also helps in keeping partners together, where they're not taking decisions, the threat of time running out to complete their project, and they have the luxury of taking the most appropriate actions in light of whatever changes are occurring. I think that's helped. The other thing that's definitely helped is we've all spoken about the common agenda, the common vision, but is to ensure that your partners are stakeholders in that common vision from the very first step. So H&M Foundation, which is our donor, and FSG, which is an expert in the collective impact approach, which we follow for collaboration, brought in partners into the conversation from the very first step when we were doing research to even identify the needs of the community. What is it that we should be working towards? And then, so all that definitely helped us in aligning. And I think there is also, what has helped is creating an environment of open communication. The partners are very, very different from each other. I think Amita mentioned it. You have the founding philosophies of organizations. Implementing partners could be very different. The size of the organizations, their capacities in different areas can be very different. But how do you bring them all together and work in collaboration with each other, in coordination with each other? And there will be conflicts, of course, right? But to provide an environment of transparency and trust where they can bring up differences and know that decisions will be taken objectively with the respect for another partner's views has also definitely helped. Communication seems so simple, but just in the last year we found it to be very, very useful. We've gone back to that system quite often. So that's definitely helped, and a shared accountability in terms of values that are non-negotiable, operating from guidelines that tell us how to resolve any sticky situations has been helpful. These are some systems that have definitely helped us collaborate, design mutually reinforcing activities. So yes, that's it from my end. Happy to come back and answer any other remaining questions.
Oh, great. Thanks, Lakshmi. I'm going to come to you now, Ashif. I know there's been a request in our chat, a question around, are there any collaboratives that are focusing on formal or informal workers? And so I think everybody's really waiting to hear from you, your experience and how has that been, running the organization itself and then also kicking off this collaborative. We have often thought that the future of collaboratives actually rests in partners like yourselves to run them. And, perhaps it's not sustainable or the need for intermediaries. We do question that, but it'd be great to hear your perspective, Ashif.
Yeah, so thanks, Neera. Before jumping to the MRC Migrant Resilience Collaborative, first I wanted to share one of my previous experience. So basically we started Jansahas in year 2000. And in year 2001, basically, we started a network called Garima Abhiyan with 20 civil society organization and community-based organization. 2 donors also contributed a lot in terms of like financial support, and we also engaged with the government agencies. And at that time, we were not very much clear ki these kind of things, like the efforts are collaborative. So basically at that time, we recognize like collective work as a network. So, and we give a name like Garima Abhiyan. And through that network or collaborative, we liberated about 48,000 women from manual sponging practice. And these all 20, most of the organizations like partner organization come from the community. So some organizations led by the former manual sponger. So just I wanted to raise this point ki collaboratives are not very new for India. Like from decades and decades, people work together, and they are not only focusing on their own organization, but they try to work with the others organizations also. In the context of like the unorganized sector worker or like the migration issue. So basically last year was very difficult and complex, particularly for the migrant community, because most of the people are aware like their situation was very complex in terms of like they want to go back their home villages. They were not able to go back, or they are not allowed actually during the lockdown period. No any real-time tracking system is exists in India. We have some law and legislation for the migrant worker, but like implementation is a big issue. The population is not very small. So in India, we have about 200 million to 250 million migrant workers. So it's a huge population. And basically, their vulnerability exposed very well during the pandemic and lockdown, not only in India, but if you can see the like globally, their vulnerability exposed. And basically in that situation, we decided we will provide support to the migrant worker during the lockdown and pandemic. We reach out to more than 1 million migrant workers with support of 40 local civil society organization and community-based organization. But we also realized that this kind of support is very like emergency response, and we required a medium term and long term support for the community. And basically Jansahas Idilgive Foundation, Vidya is also here actually. So we are very thankful to Idilgive Foundation. They contributed a lot. So Idilgive Foundation and Global Development Incubator, we three organizations came together and at the grassroots level about 40 civil society organization and the community based organization joined hand, and we started Migrant Resilience Collaborative. And basically the whole idea about the collaborative key, each and every organization come with their expertise, their knowledge, their skills. Not only like the secretariat level organization, but even the community based organization also. And basically in our collaborative, we also try to work with the government very closely, private sector, because unorganized sector workers hired by the private companies and the brands. So we are very closely working with the private company, brands, and the other organizations. And most importantly, like definitely with the funders. So multiple funders also supporting this initiative. From the first day, we realized we want to create a large impact, because in India, as I mentioned, 200 to 250 million migrant workers. And in our collaborative, we try to reach out between 10 to 15% migrant population in India. So basically in the next 3 to 5 years, we want to reach out between 10 to 15 million migrant workers through our collaborative efforts. So in that context, actually, currently we are working in 100 districts. We engage with the multiple community-based organization. And basically most of the time when we discuss about the community-based organization, our perspective is that these organizations are implementing organization. But in our case, they are not implementing organization alone, but they are co-created this whole collaborative. So basically from the first day, they engage in each and every decision making processes. They express their concern, they express or share their thoughts or voice. So their voice and their involvement is very, very important and crucial for our collaborative. So each and every partner organization, some organizations are very small, like between 5 to 10 people only working in the organization. Some organizations are very big, like 500, 600 people are working in the organization. But each and every organization play a very important role, and basically we respect their voice and participation in this process. The another thing why the collaborative is very important for us, because if we multiple organizations can come together with their skill, expertise and knowledge, we can reduce the investment actually. And in MRC, we realize very well, because our investment for per migrant family is 150 rupees. It's about like $2 per household we are investing, and we are providing 4 kind of support. Like we are developing a social registry of the migrant worker. Yeah. We are providing like various kind of support. So yeah. Like low impact and low investment and high impact we can achieve through the collaborative efforts. And the last point I want to make here, Basically, as per my understanding, collaboratives are like family. So if we can respect the emotions, because most of the time when we discuss about the scale, when we discuss about the funds, we always lose the emotional attachment of the organization and individual in the collaboratives. So I think collaboratives are like family. We need to respect the emotions, thinking together, co-create the intervention, and act together to change the community situation.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Asha. Vidya, I'm going to come to you because you're obviously also involved in this, but you can speak to one of the many collaboratives in terms of, how have you brought partners into this?
I think, since Ashif is there, I could contrast the collaborative for transforming education versus the MRC, because it's a great juxtaposition how, these two collaboratives run. But very quickly, I think CT is very clearly a funder-led collaborative, because the funding. So while the objectives were set at the beginning, and we found the right implementing partners on the ground, the co-creation part of it, of the actual implementation, began when the implementation partners came on board. But the setting of the objectives and the setting of the structure was kind of already made. It was kind of already baked, in a sense. And therefore fitting in the implementing partners and finding the right partners, and and then actually getting into the micro level planning, it followed the creation of the collaborative. And that's very interesting because I think Ashif put it very well. It's a family, at one point we're all equal partners, but it's also important to figure out how we continue to create a mechanism by which there's constant learning and exchange, especially when you have, like, for example, in our case, we have 3 partners and they all come with different levels of experience. And to create those structures. So for example, we do have a 6 weekly call, but we also have an annual mega planning exercise where everybody comes together and there's a formal sharing that happens. If you juxtapose this with the MRC, which is, I'm really proud of that collaborative, because it's, it is Jan Saha's led, and it has all the grassroots organizations who clearly are in the driver's seat, and as I think they should be. And what we're really doing along with GDI is really to provide the support and the structure and the governance and the secretariat, which are also which are equally important, and you bring in experience in that way.
Great, thanks, Vidya. I'm going to come to Shashanka, to you, and then Priya, I know you're somewhere out there. I'll bring you in right after Shashanka. But Shashanka, your reflections, and those of you who are here or elsewhere, you please contribute on the chat. There's some questions for us as a group. Shashanka, go ahead.
Yeah, so, on this segment, I would start a little differently. Maybe the NFSM Alliance is a little different from some of the exemplars that have been positioned here. We have, one funder, and all the partners are actually pretty well established institutions in the sector, in their geographies, in their areas of work. And so some things become very, very easy. I mean, aligning on purpose becomes very simple, because sanitation, we all understand it well. But if you look at it another way, so I will echo some of the comments that Amitaji made in the last segment about, having one funder, all the issues that come with it. But building on that, when there are insecurities around, how long we can stay with this momentum, even though our purposes are aligned, our abilities and resources, the triangle made from the purpose, abilities and resources, constantly under strain. So whatever we do, from the beginning, we've been, I think, very aware of this situation. And so we have designed our systems and our ways of collaborating with these things in mind. So, so to put it in a very simple way, let's remember that it's a volunteer army. And it's a volunteer army which fights a day battle And then there is the alliance battle that has to be fought in the evening, right? So it's not something that they are paid to do on a daily basis, or funded to do, rather, let me put it that way. And this has created, so the administrative structures of the alliance that we have reflect that. So we have broken ourselves into interest groups called task forces. So one task force looks at technology, another looks at municipalities and how to work with municipalities, another at gender and sanitation and gender and so on. And these task forces attract volunteers from all the partner organizations based on their own interests, on their individual interests. And so unless the leaders of these task forces are able to inspire and get people to come to a task, we will not be able to move forward. So on a regular basis, the challenge in front of the alliance or the people who are much more into it is to be able to get people and inspire them to deliver the work that we need to deliver as an alliance. And that keeps us on our toes constantly. That keeps us challenged, that keeps us ready to pivot and move towards what is important at that point in time. So that is one thing. The other, of course, challenge, which comes from the same source, is a lot of trust building needs to be put front and center, right? These are well-established institutions sharing their core knowledge, bringing it together and packaging it, like I said, into codified knowledge, and very importantly, like Pareshji pointed out, as an open source thing now. After codification, it's an open source thing. So giving credit, acknowledging people's efforts, putting it all out there, saying this came from here and we are very deeply grateful to them. That is very important for us to have partners moving in the same direction. So if I go back to my experiments, mental model and scale sort of ladder, the experiments are the domain of the partners. They do experiments on their own, which Lakshmiji was also saying. They are free to do the experiments that they want to do in their geographies or in their areas of work. But when the experiment translates to mental models, that's where a lot of debate, discussion, data, evidence, assumptions, boundary conditions, all of these need to come in. And that's where honesty, transparency needs to come in. And so trust building at this level is very important. And from there, when it goes to scale, it's about leveraging individual relationships within governments and putting it into, like somebody was mentioning in the previous segment, not just the champions, but into the bureaucracy, into the files, into the scheme guidelines. And that's where a lot of engagement happens, which also has to be transparent and trustful. So for us, transparency, sharing of credit, giving people space to do their experiments, but then also holding them accountable to, putting knowledge in a certain way, were very important for us to succeed. And so it's an ongoing process. I don't think we have cracked this, but the systems and the norms and the culture that's evolved within the alliance so far has held. So we might be a bit different, but that's what I had to contribute. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Shashanka. Just encouraging you to, and everyone else, just there's some great questions for us to reflect on as a community. Let me move to Priya. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, go ahead.
So our challenge was very similar to Ashif's, right? We needed to respond to a large number of people in very nuanced ways, and we had to do it quickly. And I think very similar to MRC and some of the other collectives, we knew that we had to be partner first, which meant that 5 things were important. The first was really trust, that we needed to trust that the partner would always put the community's interest before anything else, and that they would be the guiding force to help us figure out the right response, the right interventions. And our partners needed to know that we were completely aligned and fully in sync with their objectives and their outcomes. The second one was really deep empathy. This is sort of going back to September, October. We were expecting a lot of our partners to test out new instruments, the returnable grant, the first loss default guarantee, at a time when everyone was going through a lot of uncertainty. A lot of our execution partners had funding cutbacks, and they they needed to know that we were going to hold their hand through this process of testing out these new instruments. But it also made sense because what we were expecting them to do would help them reach out to 8 to 10 times the number of people than sort of ordinary grants being used. The third is really to use each other's strengths smartly. So in a lot of the work that we've done under Revive, we've actually partnered with NBFCs who in turn worked with small and large NGOs. We brought in other partners as well. And so everyone needed to be comfortable in understanding the strengths that each one brought to the table, but that everyone was really working towards the same outcome. The fourth one was really kind of co-creation, which is not just signing off on something that you create together at the beginning, but to work through all of the nuances of every challenge that one kind of encounters together, right? And really be partners in that process. And the last, I think, is, how a lot of people say that this is about connecting the dots, and it really wasn't. It was actually welding in the various pieces. And that meant that for us as an organization, that we needed to be very differently structured. So Samhita, I think while we've grown almost 2 to 3 times in the last 8 to 9 months, we've only added maybe 10 new people to the entire team. And it's not, the only reason that we were able to scale so quickly was that, we kind of had this partner first model. But for us internally, it meant just changes in how we thought of our role, how we thought of people's KRAs. So we went from a traditional consulting firm KRAs to saying, all of your success is measured by the success of your partner. How quickly are you able to collaborate with them to reach out to as many people in the most efficient and effective way as possible, right? So if I were to just think back to the last few months, I think what we have learned really is really broadly 2 things. That when we talk about partnerships, it means that we have to change almost fundamentally at our core to be able to truly be responsive to those partners. And the second really is that we talk about kind of trust fairly loosely, and that trust really comes into question during tough times. And if I were to ask my team, how have the last 5 months been? Very few of them will actually talk about challenges, just because everyone's kind of stepped up, including our large and small partners and our funders and our corporates and sort of everyone else into the mix. And just to give you a sense of even the types of partnerships that we've stitched together. Today, we work with NGOs and SHGs, FPOs, social enterprises, new age NBFCs, traditional MFIs, think tanks, data collection agencies, impact assessment partners, startups. So it's not trivial. It's not the same kind of partner. It's very, very different sets of organizations with different priorities, but really being held together with this common objective of supporting as many individuals and enterprises as possible collectively.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Priya. I just want to give a couple of minutes, 1 or 2 minutes, just to bring you back, Lakshmi, and then Ashif on some final thoughts, since we're not bringing you back into another session. So Lakshmi, a minute or 2 on your thoughts after having heard everyone, then I'll come to you, Ashif.
Thanks, Neera. I think really agree with all the points that were made. And if I may just add one more layer to that, it's we spoke about trust, we spoke about co-creation. The other thing that I realized is when you put the collaboration together, you're often working with leadership teams of the organization, and there is alignment there. But as you move forward, you're engaging with larger and larger number of people in in the partners group. It could be project teams, it could be field staff, and something that we've realized is it's important to have buy-in and engagement with different layers of staff in the partner organizations, so that they probably have project plans and they know what they have to do. But it's important that even your field teams realize why they have to collaborate, particularly in Samuhika Shakti, where we are looking at mutually reinforcing activities in a small community group. If people don't understand why they need to work together or why they're doing something, it's very easy to go back to working in silos or get derailed. So that's helped us through having different forums where you engage with staff at different levels, a steering committee that engages the leadership, capacity building workshops for community resource personnel. So that's something that we realized has worked well for us.
Thanks, Lakshmi. Ashif, 1 or 2 minutes?
Yeah, sure. So I think as per my understanding about the collaboratives or like the networks, diversity is very important and play a very like important role for the intervention, because like in MRC, multiple organizations are part of the MRC and they come from the diverse background. So some organizations like providing grant from, for example, IDILGU provide the grant and capacity building to the organization, like Global Development Incubator, their role is completely different, and the communities based organization role is different. So I think diversity is like we can ensure the diversity through the collaborative efforts. That's the one thing. Through this diversity and collaborative effort, we also reduce the risk, because sometimes if one organization taking the lead role and implementing the whole program, it's a very risky in the current political context, or like the as far as India, it's a very complicated. So if multiple organizations come together and work together, it's reduce the risk. And actually one very important point, the quality of discussion is increasing. So actually if the multiple organization come together and if they discuss the same point, so in one organization their thinking process is completely different, but if multiple people come together and discuss, the quality of discussion is completely changed, and the outcome of the discussion is also improved a lot. And the last point, actually, in collaborative, as per my understanding, the involvement of the community is very important, not only at the grassroots level, but at the, so for example, in MRC, we have a steering council, and here Mr. Arun Myra or Vidya Shahji, all are part of the steering council, but we try to ensure the community representation. And basically sometimes language is very big, like hurdle. So these kind of thing, if we can solve, so I think community can participate in the decision making. So that's also change the whole decision making process, or even the perspective of the collaboratives. Yeah.
Yes, great. Thank you, Ashif. Thank you, all of my scientists in this session. I'll now invite Olivia and Santosh. Maybe you can share some of your illustrations. Olivia, to you, some comments as you hear this, and then we'll segue to Richard with a bit of what can we do about this. Olivia, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I'm trying to see also what's on here. So I think so that's a really interesting conversation, and I'd love to engage in more around it, but just very quickly, a couple of thoughts. The first is there was a big discussion also amidst the chat around the definitions and what's new and what isn't. And I think my reflection on this as we're hearing the discussion as well is that ultimately what we have seen for a very long time is that in order to see long-term change, of course, it requires multiple actors, and we can call it different things. I think the piece that we're really seeing here that's also discussion around this is, what does it look like to collaborate deeply, and also to ensure that when we are talking about funders, that it's not a funder driven, that it's partner driven, that it's community driven, and that it's actually that funders are part of the equation. And I think that was a really interesting thread in the discussion here. The other piece that was raised a few times was around power, and actually I think that's really important as we look at these questions. It was raised at the end there as well around actually how do we ensure that when we're looking not just in terms of governance, but in terms of everything, that we're actually really considering who's at the table, and also that we are saying that it's not driven by a certain set of actors, and even that within those, going back to some of the earlier discussion, that it's not like these are sort of monolithic entities that we're actually looking at, but really how do we think amongst the partners and within communities also where power sits. And it comes back to some of the earlier conversations also around gender, around other dynamics as well. So I think that's another really important piece. And two other quick things. One, which is, it comes back again to why are we doing this? Why does it matter? And ultimately, I think it's about what does it take to see long-term change. That was another point that was made, that it's not about sort of a fixed time period. We know these things actually do take time. And so what does that actually look like? It's not about a collaborative for a set period of time, but really kind of what does the arc of change actually really look like? And then finally, in terms of the pandemic, I think one thing that we really do have seen through that is we are seeing some more of the kinds of discussions that we're having here. So I think if we look at that and how the importance of actually working at scale, I think has become even more key.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Olivia. I'm just going to transition to our next speaker, which is scientist, I should say, which is Richard. And so it's part of being a global edition and having the ability to be digital is to be able to bring more scientists to share during this lab. So thank you, Richard. I think a lot of what Collaborate Up is doing is going to hopefully be a roadmap or for us as a community of collaboratives to consider. So I hope you can give us some ideas how we move from some of the learning you've heard to kind of really around what might our learning agenda look and feel like. So do tell us a little bit about Collaborate Up. And thanks for joining. Yeah.
Sure. Oh yeah, no, thank you, Neera. Thank you all for being here and for taking the time. One of the key things I'm taking away from this whole conversation, and one of the principles I think behind collective impact and collective action, is that the power lies in the community and the learning lies in the community. There's so much richness in this discussion and in the chat, and so much that you can learn from one another. So the learning agenda that you're building, Neera, I think will be a really key part of how to move this forward. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to offer you 5 adaptive principles that you can use and hopefully to address some of the problems that have already been discussed. The first one is what we call distinguishing between technical versus adaptive challenges. Most problems in the world are what Ron Heifetz, who coined this term adaptive leadership, called technical problems. And a technical problem would be something that has a very clear problem definition, a very clear solution, and you just need power and authority in order to resolve it. So if my internet connection went out, that's a technical problem. It's clearly, all I have to do is figure out what went wrong, and then hopefully I either have the power or authority to resolve that problem. An adaptive problem is different. And most of the work that you are doing is composed of adaptive problems because an adaptive problem has no clear cause, might have multiple possible causes, and there's probably disagreement about what the underlying causes are. Therefore, there's also disagreement about what the possible solutions might be. So you have to then work with your stakeholders to find out how you can reframe the problem. Most people, again, like I said, are coming at this as a technical problem. So if you can help them to see it instead as an adaptive problem, and that each of them brings different things to that party, and that they therefore have to work together in order to solve that problem, because it really does require the work of multiple stakeholders. So when I was reviewing the survey material prior to today, I was struck by one of the collectives that's working on migrant issues. And with migrant issues, you have many different government ministries, many different organizations that are all trying to work on parts of this problem. And it's not that anyone is right or wrong, it's that this issue of migrants has fallen in between cracks in a highly specialized system. So what you have to then do is somehow get the parties to the table. But what we also recommend is that you focus on the fewest, most impactful parties. Oftentimes people think, I need to bring everybody in the system. We would disagree. We would say instead what you need to do is try to figure out who are the fewest, most impactful people that you can bring to the table. One of the other things I heard earlier in the conversation is the difficulty of getting multiple funders and multiple ministries or multiple organizations to work together. And part of that is because so many of them are bringing conflicting agendas. And they might view this as a fixed mindset of if you win, I lose. If you get the money, I don't. If you have the mission, then I don't. And if we can try to get them on the same side of the table and to think about, here's this problem of migrant communities, we each bring something to that fight, and how do we then collectively work on it? The third principle is that as you try to get through these cracks in the system, we need to continuously engage multiple stakeholders. I heard a little bit about co-creation earlier in the conversation. What we've seen as a challenge is that oftentimes people think, oh, I did that, I co-created. I co-created at the beginning, now I'm done, we're just implementing. This is really a work of continuous co-creation. You have to be constantly rethinking. And the diagram that I always have in my mind is like an interlocking loop. If you start here and you start to try something and define something, you learn from that, you adapt it, you try it again, and you go. And you have to be continuously doing that. And getting your stakeholders to think in that adaptive loop and thinking and working together in that framework. And so one of the key things that we always recommend is in putting in place a meeting cadence. You need to have a continuous meeting cadence that says we're going to get together and we're going to check in and work on these things together. And we're also going to build in the opportunity to pause and reflect. So we're implementing in this agile way, but we're also taking periodic breaks. So your implementation meetings, as an example, might occur on a weekly or monthly basis. Your pause and reflect might take place on a biannual or quarterly basis, where you step back as a collective group and look and see how you're doing. And then lastly, I think what you'll have to do is think about how you do two other things. One is put in place a flexible and agreed upon governance model that also provides for amicable exit. Many people establish originally some kind of governing documents or some way of deciding that they're going to make decisions. But when you're dealing with the power imbalances that we've talked about in terms of funding and the roles of different organizations, the convening power or the mission that each of those might have, recognizing in the governance documents how you're going to value their contributions, but also create more equitable decision-making amongst the different parties, and to provide for the possibility that somebody might not want to keep going with you, and for that to be okay. We think of this as sort of framing a prenuptial agreement so that you can get divorced if you need to, but in an amicable way where everybody still feels whole and complete if you have to separate. And the last thing that I'll touch on is, I heard a lot from Sasanka in the last session, is about this issue of the volunteer army. And one of the things that we always have to keep in mind is that, as I said before, you don't have organizations that are, for whom this is their full-time job. They're coming together, they're providing their piece of it, and then they're going back and doing whatever they were doing before. So you need to create a collective or institutional memory. And many times that is one of the biggest things that a backbone organization can help do, is to provide that institutional memory that documents decisions and helps to move the collective forward. Because oftentimes what we see is that even if we've established our meeting cadence, the players change. So we think about organizations as monoliths, but what we would really say is you have to get in and understand the personalities of who you're working with in those organizations. I heard before talking about looking at the organizational motivations. I would also say you have to understand the personal motivations of the people on the other side, whether that's the funders, government ministries, or your other NGO partners. What are their personal motivations? And I often think of people thinking that, okay, we got to engage the government, we got to engage private sector. I don't know, those things don't exist. The government doesn't exist, the private sector doesn't exist, businesses don't exist, ministries don't exist. They are people. So you have to get past this idea that it's an organization and really look at, is it Neera? Is it Ashif? Is it Lakshmi? Is it Richard? And what is Richard's motivation? What is Lakshmi's motivation? What is Neera's motivation? And work with them. And it oftentimes, what you need to do is have the experimentation that allows you to find different partners who have the emotional intelligence to be able to work with you. Mm-hmm. If they come with a fixed mindset, or they come with the idea that they can't shift, or that they have to have all of the credit, you're never going to get anywhere. So 5 quick takeaways. Number 1, reframe your problem as adaptive instead of technical. Second, diagnose your level of engagement and co-creation, working with the fewest, most impactful people. Third, create an agreed upon governance model with amicable exits. Fourth, establish a meeting cadence around agile sprints, and keep a collective memory.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. That's great food for thought and a lot for us to include, especially as we kick off moving into a learning agenda for this year. Couple of minutes, Olivia, if I can just bring you back, some closing thoughts, a minute or two, and then we'll put a poll up. We'll show you a bit of Santosh, and we'll tee it up for tomorrow. But some closing thoughts, Olivia?
Thanks, Neera. So I'll say three things I actually heard from the discussion. I will say this is an amazing group, and all collaboratives that I both either know or know of, so a treat to get to hear from everybody here. So the first thing I would say is that I think was mentioned was around this kind of importance of having a global approach and vision, and really what is it? Because ultimately collaborating is actually just a means to an end. And so it's really about what is it that we're actually really trying to do, and highlighting those values and what it is that we're all working towards, whether it's around the individuals, whether it's around the institutions. What does that really take to get things really embedded in the system? And I think that was something that was really important and raised. The second point is around the need and ability to reflect and to be flexible, and to recognize that you don't necessarily come in with one theory and stick to it, but really what does it take to be able to make this kind of change, and look at the dynamics, look at the structural barriers, look at power, really try to understand those. And I think that was another point that was really important. And the final piece quickly is that ultimately we really do need collaboration in order to see these kind of results at scale that we're all working towards. And so this issue and this approach is crucial if we want to be trying to address the issues that we're seeing now and will see in the future. And so having the chance to learn about what works, what doesn't, what are the challenges, I think is so key. And having people you can turn to in those moments to say, how have you done this? What have you seen? I think is key. And so excited about those possibilities and being part of that kind of a learning community.
Great. Well, thank you, Olivia. Thank you, everyone. Before you leave, we're just kicking off a poll. We want a sense of who wants to join this community, who wants to help us shape this learning agenda. We think it has to be more than the 13 of us. So let's put up our poll, please, folks, and click through so we get a sense of those who'd like to engage. We will place an email address, drop us an email if you'd like to be part of this learning community. This is just the beginning, and a lot more is to be done. Let's give this a couple of minutes. Can you put up the slide, my friends, on what is up tomorrow? Dasra Philanthropy Week. We have learning labs throughout this week. So I hope you can join us for what is tomorrow and the day after. In the meantime, stay safe, and thank you all. We'll give it a couple of minutes for the poll to finish. Can you put up the slide for tomorrow, please? While the poll keeps going, it's great. Oh, we're all admiring, Santosh, your illustrations, and we'll share that for sure. Thank you. So folks, join this session tomorrow. It's all about how to make your boards more effective. I'm sure we could all learn and be better at this. And so with that, I will close off this session. Thank you all. See you tomorrow.